Okay, then we start up with this session number 2, a very exciting panel, which is called NATO and Regional States. So welcome to all of you. Good morning here in the United States and good afternoon to all of our friends in Europe. We have a very exciting panel with us today. We will do 3 things. My name is Tormod Heier. I work at the Norwegian Command and Staff College in Oslo. We will do 3 things. First, the panelists will just very briefly present themselves. Thereafter, we will start with the various presentations of the perspectives here today, and finally, with some Q&A at the end. Each presentation approximately 10 to 12 minutes. Caroline, won't you just briefly present yourself before Jorge and Håkon and Njord, please?
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm just connecting to the internet, but in the meantime, I'm Caroline. I'm a professor at Loughborough University in the UK, and many years ago, I was a Russianist or a Sovietologist, and now I work on Arctic security, UK defence matters, and have contributed to the new Arctic framework in the UK. So delighted to join you.
Excellent, thank you. And Dr. Jorge.
I am Jorge Benitez. I'm the professor of security studies here at the Marine Command and Staff College, and I'm also an expert on NATO affairs. And if you're interested in NATO issues, you can follow my coverage of it on NATO Source on Twitter.
Excellent, thank you. And Håkon?
Yes, thank you. My name is Håkon Lunde Saxi. I'm an associate professor at the Command and Staff College at the Norwegian Defence University College in Oslo. And I work on Norwegian and Nordic and Northern European defense policy and military strategy. And I'll be presenting on Nordic defense cooperation. Thank you.
No.
So my name is Njord Wegge. I'm an associate professor at Norwegian Defence University College, Norwegian Military Academy. I'm here to present a paper on the strategic role of the land power dimension on the NATO's northern flank.
Well, that sounds brilliant. Before we start, just a few reminders. You represent yourself and not your institution. The web cameras can be turned off while you're not speaking. Please note to mute your phones when you're not using them, and send questions on the web.
Of the land power domain on the NATO's northern flank. So if you could take next slide. The background for this article I'm working on is that when we talk about the northern flank of NATO, it's usually a maritime perspective that's at the core, for good reasons. So as we see on these maps, the northern area of responsibility for NATO is pretty much littoral, coastal areas, it's islands, it's ocean. But there are also territorial part here, and particularly in northern Norway. And as you know, Norway actually have a land border towards Russia, in addition to the maritime border. So there's a need to know more about this strategic role, the land component of NATO's northern flank mean. What does it mean? So let's take the next slide. So my research question, the key research question is, what is the strategic role of land power on this flank? And to what degree does the structure and composition of the forces that are there matter at this political strategic level? So next slide. So focusing on the political strategic level does not mean that the operational tactical doesn't matter, or the security political overall situation matter, but I want to dig specifically into what is in between here that's less researched. And my method for doing this article is to use interviews. I've had approximately 14-15 interviews so far with key persons of expertise from the Army, Ministry of Defense, and also academics. I looked into doctrines and concept papers, and also used a lot of historical sources. So the starting point is in many ways the Cold War. Then you had 3 maybe mains, or the main scenario was pretty much an overwhelming Soviet army invading NATO on a broad flank, perhaps having Germany as a central flank, but it was looked at as a massive existential threat, basically. And for Norway's case, and especially in northern Norway, it was important to avoid a defeat without fighting. So being a small nation with limited army and resources and not having any permanent bases on Norwegian soil, the key task was to delay the enemy, basically, and try to stop that Lyngen line where there's more mountains and it's a very, very tricky place to pass with large land forces, and basically wait for Allied support. So the Cold War context certainly was different than what we see today, but many of the elements that has sort of like rised again after the Crimea annexation in 2014, they are still relevant. So still it's about Allied reinforcements. How do we manage the restriction we've put in place on, for example, bases, foreign bases? And to what degree should we wait on Allied support, or should we do more alone, for example? So next slide. So there's no consensus today in the military environments and the academic communities on how a future land warfare with high-tech peer adversaries, how that would look. So for Norway, the context is obviously that we are very close to the Russian strategic submarine bases at the Kola Peninsula. That's a core strategic interest for Russia to protect. And therefore, we are within what's called their denial zone in the northern parts of Norway. And as we discussed earlier today, there's good reasons to regard Norway in this context as an inside force, basically, in this denial bubble. In the Norwegian debate, we have had, let's say, a very popularized version called the traditionalist, wanting to keep many of the existing structures in place, like mechanized, heavy cavalry units, etc. While modernists might say this is outdated, we need long-range, light systems, distributed structures. The old brigade structure is something of the past. And this fits directly into the debate going on and the innovation taking place within the Marine Corps Force Design 2030. And we have also had Norwegian documents discussing this for the army. So what should the future army of Norway look like? And in these documents, we can see both those, let's say, elements sort of popularized as the traditionalist and the modernists. And again, all of this takes place within a context, a political context. We have the Nordic dimension. Sweden and Finland is not NATO members, but they are getting closer and closer integrated into partnership for peace programs and operational activities. We can also see peacetime operation being more similar to what one would prepare for in crisis and war. Next slide. So lifting the view a little bit, so what is their overall role of land forces? I think as a political scientist, it's a very, let's say, classical view to say that international relations take place within an anarchy and a modified anarchy. We have international law, we have institutions, but still there's no supreme government being able to force their, for example, international law through. So then you have an uneven distribution of power capabilities. This really matter. And these power capabilities influence states' room for maneuver. And we also see there's only land forces that pretty much can defeat other adversaries' land forces even today. And to hold and take territory remains the core sort of factor for land forces. Next slide. So pretty much concluding here a little bit, I would say that taking into account the operational technical level, but also the political context, as well as geographical factors, highly relevant as a context to the northern flank. The strategic role of land power is different in Finnmark and further south and west. So in Finnmark, it's not so much about actually winning or being able to win battles. It's about being there, being able to deliver effect over time, and to actually create dilemmas for an adversary, to have long distance capabilities. While further south and west, it's more about using the full array of all of the army in a combined joint way, and also to actually deliver significant losses and ultimately win battles. And this is key strategic roles that are a little bit different depending on where on NATO's flank you are. This last slide. So I would say there's not one specific fighting mode or land power structure that stands out as the correct answer to, let's say, the operational debate about where to go. But there's like a holistic, we need to have a holistic view where there needs to be several different flexible structure in place at the same time. Of course, creating dilemmas for a small state, but still this is probably the right way to go.
Excellent, Njord. Thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation. We now go over to our next colleague from Oslo, Håkon Lunde Saxi. Please, the floor is yours for the next 10-12 minutes.
All right. Thank you very much, Tormod, and greetings from Oslo. I'll just very briefly try to get my PowerPoint presentation up on screen here. Can you see it back there on the East Coast?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much. Now, my topic is entitled Operational Military Cooperation between Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And the reason why I chose Norway, Sweden, and Finland was at that time when we were developing these papers upon which the presentation is based last year. Norway, Sweden, and Finland in September 2020 signed an agreement which aimed to look at the possibility of coordinating their national operational plans and to look at the possibility of developing some common military plans. In September of this year, 2021, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark signed a similar agreement to do exactly the same. So if I was to revise the title today, I would simply write Operational Nordic Military Cooperation. Now, to understand why it is significant that these Nordic countries have signed these agreements, I think it's important to understand some of the background of where the Nordic states are coming from. Sorry. Now, I think in the United States and in most of Western Europe, the Nordic states are regarded as pretty similar, small liberal democracies, peaceful states who cooperate on a range of issues, and that's generally true that they do cooperate on most issues, but it has not generally been the case when it comes to military cooperation. As Njord mentioned, the Nordic states are not and have not historically been allies, formal treaty allies, and this continues to put limits on how far their military cooperation can progress. Just to give you a very brief overview of Nordic defense cooperation since the Second World War. From 1949 until about the end of the Cold War in 1990, I'd say Nordic cooperation was mostly characterized by abstinence. It was more or less a taboo topic to cooperate on hard military security between the Nordic states because of their different security policy alignments. So as Njord mentioned, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland were original signatories of the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949, whereas Sweden and Finland chose to remain military non-aligned and aiming for neutrality in wartime. So they were normally categorized as neutral states. Now that's a very, very broad overview of their security policy orientation during the Cold War. It's a bit more complicated than that. Sweden, for example, had some quite substantial secret military cooperation with the Western powers during the Cold War. But in general terms, it is true that the Nordic states were not allied, and that military cooperation was very, very limited. UN peacekeeping, traditional UN peacekeeping, was the one area where they could do substantial military cooperation during the Cold War. Then, when the Cold War ended, this changed, because it allowed Sweden and Finland to join the West. Both states joined the European Union in 1995, and they drew very close to NATO. And so the Nordic states were able to cooperate substantially on what I would call peacetime cooperation. So they were able to cooperate on things like education and training of their military forces, acquisition and upgrading of the equipment, logistics, and in particular the participation in what is in the Nordic states known as international military operations. So normally peace support operations far away from the Nordic countries. So the Nordic states deployed a Nordic Polish brigade, for example, to Bosnia as part of the NATO mission there in 1996. They cooperated in Kosovo, they've cooperated in Afghanistan, to a certain extent even in the Middle East, although to a far lesser extent than in Afghanistan and in the Balkans. So they did substantial cooperation on international military deployments. But there was very little cooperation on preparing to defend the Nordic region at home. And there were two reasons for that. Firstly, because there was no real danger of a major conflict which would engulf the entire Nordic Baltic region at that time. And secondly, because they were not formal allies. Now, I would say that this changed approximately around the time of the Ukrainian crisis in 2014. At that time, it became apparent that Russia was indeed willing to use military force against its neighbors in order to achieve its political objectives. And an attack even against a NATO country could not be ruled entirely out. And so NATO reoriented towards collective defense in Europe, and the Nordic states reoriented their defense policies towards once again their near abroad and their own territorial defense at home. And this also impacted on Nordic defense cooperation. And first of all, between the two powers that were military non-aligned, Sweden and Finland, who since 2015 have allowed their militaries to do common training and planning for combined joint operations to defend themselves if there is a major crisis or a war in the Baltic Sea area. Now, they are not allies, and there are no security policy guarantees exchanged between Sweden and Finland, but they've gone very far in terms of doing the practical preparations to do combined joint operations. But there was not a similar development initially between the NATO Nordics and the non-NATO Nordics because of all the complications involved, because the NATO Nordics were, of course, heavily involved in NATO collective defense planning, whereas the non-NATO Nordics were not. And this changed in September of 2020, when, as previously mentioned, Norway, Sweden, and Finland signed an agreement to examine the possibility of coordinating their national operational plans, and specifically to look at the possibility of develop common operational plans dealing with the Nordkalotten area. And the Nordkalotten area is basically roughly the area north of the polar circle, which you can see on this map, the blue dotted line there. And if you examine the map, the geographical reasons behind this initiative, I think, are fairly obvious. All the Sweden, Norway, and Finland are all concerned about Russian revisionism, and they face similar challenges in their high north. For example, Norway is as you can see, is a very long-stretched country, and the north-south, the passage between the north and south is to a large extent just one road and one railroad, so it's fairly easy to interfere with that connection. And of course, as the map Njord showed you, it demonstrated much of the coastline of Norway would be in the area where Russia intends to do sea denial, so sending reinforcements and supplies via the seaways would be challenging. So of course there would be a lot of advantages if you could use, say, Swedish territory in a crisis or in a war. And on the other hand, if you look at Sweden and Finland's strategic position, if they are to be reinforced by their partners, because they are not members of NATO, but they have very strong partnerships with the United States. They've signed bilateral and trilateral agreements with the United States, and with also joined all kinds of cooperation arrangements with the major European powers, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. So, but if reinforcements are to arrive from the West to Sweden and Finland, it would have to come via Norway. So they are mutually dependent upon one another, and there are lots of operational and tactical benefits to enhancing their cooperation. Similarly, in the south, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark signed an agreement just in September of this year to look at the cooperation specifically in the geographical area around the Danish Straits, which they're all dependent on in order to bring in supplies and possibly reinforcements. And you can see these patterns, how dependent they are, for example, on the major national Swedish exercises. In 2017, Sweden had a major national defense exercise. During that exercise, American reinforcements were brought in through the North Sea to Göteborg, and then transitioned across to go across to the islands in the Baltic Sea. So so they are to a large extent mutually dependent upon one another if there is a large-scale crisis or a war in the Nordic-Baltic region. And I think these agreements largely reflect that. So of course the big question is, does this then mean that the Nordic states are now moving towards some sort of Nordic alliance? Well, not at the moment, because there are no binding security policy commitments exchanged between them. However, I think it's fair to say that we can almost define this as a sort of a functional alliance. They are doing all the practical measures in peacetime that are necessary in order to do combined joint operations in the Nordic region in a crisis or in wartime. And there would be a lot of pressure to, once you've made these arrangements and these plans, there would be a lot of pressure to actually implement them if a crisis did occur. And they've been very public about this too. These agreements are largely made public, and the purpose of that is, of course, to signal to the potential adversary that the Nordic states, even though they are not formal allies, have the capacity and the willingness to stand together if there is a major crisis. And then the most likely opponent, Russia, will have to take that into consideration. So there's a bit of signaling here, and large emphasis on credible deterrence. So I think I'll stop there, and I think we can elaborate on some of these issues when we come to the Q&A section. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Håkon. A very interesting presentation. Absolutely. Then we give the word to our next panelist from the United States, George.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So I'm going to discuss NATO's strategic concerns about the Arctic. And to begin with, I'd like to begin with some of the key political issues of the problems of the Arctic. The first one being Russia. Russia's Arctic covers more than half of Russia's territory and provides 20% of Russia's GDP. So much so that Russian President Vladimir Putin has cited estimates that he puts the value of Arctic mineral riches at about 30 trillion. Putin, unfortunately for Russia, Putin has condemned that country to an 18th century national economy that can only sell natural resources to the rest of the world. And when existing Russian sources of these resources run out, Putin is betting his survival and that of the Russian economy on the resources they hope to exploit from the Arctic. Therefore, it is clear that for Putin, the Arctic is a top national priority for Russia. And Putin has backed it up with the largest military buildup in the Arctic of any nation state in the region. For example, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has warned, quote, increased Russian presence, more Russian bases in the high north have also triggered the need for more NATO presence, and we have increased our presence there with more naval capabilities, presence in the air, and not least, the importance of protecting transatlantic undersea cables transmitting a lot of data. In response to this, we have some very sharp words from Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, in which he said, and I quote, We hear whining about Russia expanding its military activities in the Arctic, but everyone knows that it's our territory, our land. We bear full responsibility for the Arctic coast to be safe, and everything our country does there is fully legitimate. Russian leaders could not be any more crystal clear that they feel emboldened and entitled for their militarization of the Arctic and their activities there. But in addition to Russia's behavior, we also have to pay at least some attention to NATO's behavior. And that is, we have to realize that NATO has reduced its presence in the Arctic significantly since the Cold War. For example, after the end of the Cold War, NATO closed its combined joint headquarters in Stavanger, Norway, and its combined air operations center, KEAG, also in Norway. These are some of the external pressures upon the alliance and their concerns for having a NATO strategy. But the key problem seems to be internal, within the alliance, the lack of consensus among allies over what should be NATO's role in the Arctic. Of the 5 Arctic states, those that border the Arctic Ocean, 4 of them are members of NATO. So there should be a strong opportunity there for consensus and cooperation. But there's differences in threat perception about what Russia's activities are there, and there are sharp differences over how the alliance should respond. Canada, Denmark, and Norway have all expressed caution about asking NATO to lead more of a direct response to Russia. For some NATO leaders, the priority is to preserve a low-tension Arctic, and they wish to avoid NATO actions that may antagonize Russia unnecessarily. As a result, despite the language which I just quoted by Secretary General Stoltenberg, the role and activities of NATO in the Arctic have remained limited. For example, in 2009, NATO planned to include a paragraph just talking about the Arctic at its summit in Strasbourg and Kiel, but this was blocked by Canada. Furthermore, Canada participates in exercises with the US and Denmark, but only at the bilateral level, and does not participate or allow these exercises to be labeled as NATO exercises. And more recently, a few weeks ago, the chief of the UK's defense staff, General Nick Carter, publicly offered to, quote, cooperate in terms of helping Canada do what Canada needs to do as an Arctic country. A spokesman for Canada's government said they support more cooperation with allies, but said nothing about the specific offer from the British. Canada is not the only Arctic NATO member with concerns about a more direct role for the alliance in the Arctic. For example, as Norway's Ambassador Krutnes reminded us yesterday, from Norway's perspective, quote, we don't want to provoke the Russians. So we always have to balance between deterrence and reassurance. NATO does favor some NATO involvement, but mostly in terms of preparedness and exercise, not a direct or forward presence. Therefore, because of the lack of consensus among the Arctic members of NATO, the role of the alliance in the Arctic continues to be underdeveloped. Therefore, so what can be done? You have heard from the previous panel at this conference that the UN wants a bigger and more direct role for NATO in the Arctic. But I don't believe that that will happen anytime soon. Partly because our Arctic allies don't have a consensus on what they agree upon for a NATO role in the Arctic, and also because the Arctic is not a top priority for the US. And even though it wants more activities and capabilities there, future defense dollars will be instead invested in other regions of the world. But can any progress be made? Therefore, I have come up with some of the following recommendations on how we can improve security in the Arctic, given this context of external threat and pressure and internal lack of consensus. First, let me begin by explaining what NATO should not make a priority, and that is the path that it's headed on right now. NATO should not make changing its documents a low priority, but instead, all of the effort seems to be in changing some of the language and words in which NATO describes the Arctic, instead of trying to improve NATO's capabilities to deal in the Arctic. Some have mentioned that the last maritime strategy by NATO in 2011 didn't even mention the Arctic. And there are strong calls from multiple sources that the upcoming strategic concept to be released at the next NATO summit next year should discuss the Arctic. From my perspective, the danger is that changing NATO documents will consume time and political capital with little to show for it in terms of more and better Arctic capabilities for the allies. In other words, members will declare that NATO has acted by changing its documents and promise more capabilities, and then little attention or resources will be invested in actually implementing them. Like the US national security strategy, NATO's strategic concept is more often a wish list that goes unfulfilled. Instead of spending more time and political efforts changing these documents, I believe the US and its allies should focus instead on producing tangible Arctic capabilities. Not more of a direct role, but I think we need to keep it at the level of the national and bilateral capabilities effort. So my first recommendation is we need to increase NATO's Arctic capabilities, not NATO's Arctic presence. The allies need to urgently find an answer for the question of how much NATO is wanted in the Arctic. Because of Russia's continuing militarization of the Arctic, allies need to strengthen deterrence in the region. But at the same time, and this is one thing the US needs to understand, in order to minimize Russian escalation and provocations, most of the Arctic allies want to strengthen deterrence without putting NATO at the forefront of the response to Russia. To do this, I believe that there are some key steps that could be taken forward, even within this nuanced security environment. The first one is NATO needs to urgently improve its ISR in the Arctic. There is gross inability, even though some of our allies have extensive capability there. The Norwegians are particularly good in their ISR, but all NATO Arctic members need to improve their ISR because the region is so large, it is changing so much over climate change, and the Russian activity there is at a level that is very hard to overestimate. So for example, not long ago, the Canadians conducted an Arctic exercise, and they stumbled upon a secret Russian exercise that they did not know was taking place near them. No one had been aware that the Russians were deployed there, and the Canadians had no idea what they were doing there. This is one of the clear-cut examples of we need more situational awareness of this large and very geostrategic area for the alliance. In fact, last year, the Secretary General's Reflection Group recommended that NATO needs to enhance its situational awareness across the High North and the Arctic. I think this needs to be highlighted and emphasized. What we need is more domain awareness capabilities such as radar and air surveillance, ISR systems, early warning systems, radio communications, and satellite coverage. And in particular, we must be careful that our focus is not just on air and space. We also need to improve our situational awareness underwater. We need better attention to underwater awareness capabilities. For example, underwater listening posts, the kind that we had during the Cold War, that should take better advantage of the technology that's available in 2021. My other key recommendation is NATO members need more national capabilities for extreme conditions in the Arctic cold weather operations. It looks fine to put a NATO flag on a forward presence in the High North, but unfortunately, the NATO members who actually have the troops have very few units who can actually be up there, even deploy there or be sustainable there for a very large amount of time. And those units have very few weapons, equipment, and material that can sustain the very harsh measures up there. Therefore, I think this means that for NATO members, not only do they need new ships and planes for the Arctic, but they also need to make sure that their existing and future platforms are hardened for Arctic conditions and tested in the extreme weather. The US in particular needs to build more icebreakers and transform more of its surface ships so they're capable of cold weather and operations. My third recommendation is the allies should invest in more national and bilateral exercise in extreme cold weather environments. They don't have to be in the Arctic, but they have to be tested, exercised, and trained together in these type of environments when communications and command and control can be severely contested. And also, finally, my final recommendation is more allies should send representatives to Norway's Center of Excellence for Cold Weather Operations. We need to make better use of its value to the alliance. And I will conclude with one good sign of progress. In February, President Biden and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau agreed to upgrade the North American Aerospace Defense Command, commonly known as NORAD. NORAD consists of satellites, ground-based radar, and Air Force bases located mostly in Africa and the Canadian Arctic. We need more of this type of national and bilateral reinvestment in Arctic awareness and capabilities. My focus is NATO needs to stop talking about Arctic strategy and Arctic deterrence and needs to start investing more in national Arctic capabilities. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, George, for a very precise and sobering. Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Caroline. It's finally your go now. We've been very excited to hear what you have to say before we start.
Thank you. Good morning to colleagues in the United States. Good afternoon to those in Europe. So today I will speak about the work a colleague and I are carrying out on UK defence and the Arctic. If I could have the next slide, please, that would be great. So part, at least, of the UK's interest, long-standing interest in the Arctic, has arisen because of climate change and the shifting level of ice, particularly the Greenland ice sheet, and our concern in the UK that changing climate will affect not just the Arctic, but of course rising levels of water in places like Bangladesh. So we see the Arctic as being interconnected to global ecosystems. And one particular claim that the UK has to be a near Arctic state or to be an Arctic stakeholder is leadership in science, and particularly in science diplomacy. And here I will also note that many other states now have those credentials or claims to those credentials, and certainly the UK has led the way, and I think has been followed by states like India and Turkey. Turkey, of course, now regards itself as a polar stakeholder in using science really as a way in to understanding the Arctic. So next slide, please. We're keenly aware of our geostrategic position and our pretensions as a near Arctic state, resting, of course, on Scotland in particular. But in terms of climate change, proximity, our reliance on energy sources, particularly from Norway, and our burgeoning commercial interests as the Arctic or parts of the Arctic become more accessible, lead us to this renewed interest, and I will come back to this, in Arctic affairs. And Duncan and I believe that really over the last 10 years, and it hasn't been an easy journey, from our first enunciation of an Arctic framework strategy, Arctic framework document, we've had in fits and starts begun to show far more interest in Arctic military affairs. To mark the 25th anniversary of the Arctic Council, our Foreign Office enunciated our interest, saying that we hoped very much that the Arctic could remain a zone of harmony or of peace, as it had become with the foundation of the Arctic Council at the end of the 1990s, and that it could not return to Cold War nuclear tensions. So that is the hope of the FCO. But Chatham House rules, Duncan and I have explored with representatives of the MOD, and this is my view, not theirs. There has, over the last 10 years, but particularly since 2018, been a far heavier bootprint, if I can put that, in Arctic affairs. This is predominantly due to our credentials, our geostrategic position, but also, of course, since the incursion into Georgia, and then, of course, the annexation of Crimea, the Russia question. Yesterday, we debated a fascinating discussion, thank you to colleagues, about how to approach Russia, integration, exclusion, and everything in between. For us in the UK, my view is it is particularly difficult to think of engagement with Russia, but we're far more inclined, in my view, to engagement with Russia than we are to China at the moment, which is interesting as China becomes increasingly an Arctic presence. But really, of course, our concerns with Mr. Putin's Russia lie in the grey zone, the poison attacks in Salisbury in 2018, and the general activities of the GRU in the grey zone and in person on the soil of the UK. So for us, Russian ambition, and I'm keenly aware of the debates about remilitarization versus reinvigoration, revisionism versus a natural place for Russia as the preeminent Arctic state. But I think since the Integrated Defence Review, and in particularly if you look at the 2021 Defence Command paper, the UK has increasingly stressed the High North, the North Atlantic, Iceland, and with our JEF partners protecting the northern flank, and that continued commitment to lead the forward presence in Estonia. In my own view, I think post-Brexit, the UK has adopted, after 2 decades of expeditionary missions, we have adopted, I think, a more traditional role of a defensive balancer and the defence of Northern Europe and the northern flank. We, of course, have famously, under Prime Minister Johnson, led a tilt to the Indo-Pacific in conjunction with our American friends. But nevertheless, I think if you look at the Defence Command paper and look not just at statements but investment, we can see a continuing and enhanced commitment to the North. Capabilities which had, I would agree absolutely with our previous speaker, fallen into disarray, are now being re-enhanced. We've restored the UK's MPAs, our ASW capabilities, and we have placed significant £132 million into RAF Lossiemouth. And we have also, of course, since 2018, which was a deeply disappointing year for those of us who advocate the continued and important reliance on our Marines, a further commitment to the Royal Marines in Norway. We've seen Icelandic policing for the first time in years, plus we've had maritime operations in the Barents Sea, a strengthening of ties with Finland and Sweden, and as was mentioned, the recent overture to Canada. We are shipbuilding again in numbers, and we have just recently seen a £40 million investment in the Royal Marines. Of particular note is the ambition of the Littoral Response Group, both LRG North and LRG South. And here I think what's of particular note is the attempt to use UK amphibious forces in a more dispersed and agile way and closer to home in both the North Atlantic and the Baltics. Adaptations include a new future commando force, a renaming perhaps, and the LRG North will include quite innovative capabilities in introducing uninhabited systems, maintaining a forward presence, and undertaking and building defence diplomacy. So not simply military capabilities. There is, of course, if I'm honest, a question over capabilities to form a credible LRG, which is under review. But nevertheless, the integrated review did promise to build greater amphibious capabilities. And what is new, I think, if those ambitions come off, is the notion of persistence. That is that there will be a persistent state of high readiness, precision strikes, high mobility, and networked autonomous systems for LRG North. Now, of course, if I could have the next slide, please. When I'm talking about the UK and the Arctic, and the next slide, what we're also talking about is a very particular Arctic, as there are many Arctics. And I think one of the issues that we're all going to have to get used to is that we think of the European, North Atlantic, the European and Russian Arctic. But of course, with the emergence of China, perhaps the opening up of the sea routes across the Arctic, we might want to think of a transpolar Arctic. And a transpolar Arctic will necessarily mean a much greater Chinese presence in the Arctic. And yesterday it was mentioned, and I agree, that as of yet, China is not a military threat in the Arctic, but it is certainly a threat in terms of soft power, in terms of penetration of certain states, particularly after the financial crisis of 2008. And this important question about the security dilemma that exists in the Arctic and how the Russians view an enhancement of the NATO position is an interesting one. The problem or the challenge is, of course, is that
we want Russia to adopt our own understandings, quite rightly in my view, of sovereignty, of governance, of good governance structures. But I think what we've become keenly aware of is that there is an intellectual gap between, and a practical gap between, Russian versions of sovereignty in the High North, particularly over Svalbard, and the way in which the Russians conceive of the people. So in our view, sovereignty consists of territorial sovereignty. The Russians have a very different view, which is it rests on sovereignty and Russian-speaking peoples. And I can elaborate on that in the questions. But next slide, please. But from the UK, we have reinforced, committed to the defence of our NATO allies and our friends and allies in the High North and in what we call the wider North. And so the key question is where to place Russia in all of this, how to negotiate with Russia. And I don't think the Arctic Council, I think it's a hugely useful vehicle, particularly the groups in which we do speak to our Russian colleagues and through to our Russian colleagues. But we do need to think about innovative ways, I think, of bringing Russia into some form of negotiation and dialogue beyond and above search and rescue. So I'll stop there.
Very thoughtful presentation. I want to thank all the four of you for so good presentations, and I hope you enjoy us for the rest of the day. All the best in Europe.
Thank you.